When I came home that Tuesday afternoon, every family photo album I'd spent 45 years protecting was gone. My daughter Rachel had packed them into plain brown boxes while I was out buying groceries. She looked me in the eye and said, "Mom, it's time to stop living in the past." As I tore open the first box, a single photograph slipped from inside my wedding album. It showed my late husband David standing beside a woman I'd never seen before, holding a baby. I had been married to that man for 45 years, and somehow this picture had been hidden from me the entire time. If this story touches your heart, I'd love for you to stay with me until the very end. Please like this video if you've ever held on to something that meant the world to you. Subscribe if you enjoy stories about family forgiveness and unexpected truths. And before we begin, tell me in the comments, what time is it where you're watching from, and where in the world are you? I'd also love to know if you found a photograph that could change everything you believed about someone you loved. Would you keep searching for the truth or put it away forever? My name is Amanda Perez. I'm 68 years old, and until 2 years ago, I believed I knew every chapter of my husband's life. Now I'm not so sure. I spent 34 years teaching second grade in Columbus, Ohio. Children have a way of reminding you that every little moment matters. Maybe that's why I never threw anything away. Birthday cards, Christmas ornaments my daughter made in kindergarten ticket stubs from family vacations, handwritten notes David left on the kitchen counter before work. I kept them all. But nothing meant more to me than my family photo albums. They weren't just pictures. They were proof that our life had happened. Every Sunday afternoon after church, David would joke that I loved my albums more than television. He wasn't entirely wrong. We'd make coffee sit at the dining room table, and I'd slowly turn each page while he laughed at our hairstyles from the 70s. "Please don't show anyone that mustache," he'd always say. I'd laugh. "I married the mustache." He'd roll his eyes. That's true love. Those memories became even more precious after cancer took him. David fought for 18 months. He never complained. Even during chemotherapy, he smiled at every nurse who entered the room. When he passed away, the silence inside our house became unbearable. For weeks, I couldn't sleep in our bedroom. I would wander through the living room after midnight and open an album instead. Looking at our photographs made me feel like he wasn't completely gone. Rachel never understood that. My daughter loved her father deeply, but she handled grief differently. She buried herself in work. She became even more successful as a financial consultant. Her calendar was always full. Conference calls, flights, meetings, numbers, plans. Everything in her life had a solution. Everything except losing her father. She visited every weekend bringing groceries and insisting she wanted to help. At first, I appreciated it. Then little comments started slipping into our conversations. "Mom, this house is getting crowded." "You really don't need 30 boxes in the attic." "Nobody looks at old albums anymore. They're collecting dust." I always smiled and changed the subject, because she didn't understand. Those albums weren't clutter. They were my family. When I found them packed away that Tuesday afternoon, it felt as though someone had packed away my entire life. Rachel didn't see it that way. "I was trying to help," she said as she folded another cardboard box. "You didn't ask." "I knew you'd say no. Because they're important. They're keeping you stuck." "No," I answered quietly. "They're keeping me connected." She sighed. "Mom, Dad wouldn't want you living like this." The words hit harder than she realized. Nobody got to decide what David would have wanted except the man himself. I didn't argue anymore. Instead, I carried the first box into the dining room. My hands were shaking, not from anger, from fear. The albums had always been organized in chronological order. Every birthday, every anniversary, every vacation, every Thanksgiving If Rachel had mixed them together, it would take me days to sort everything. I carefully lifted the first album, our wedding. Blue leather cover, gold lettering. I smiled despite everything. Then that photograph fell onto the table. At first I thought it belonged somewhere else. Maybe it had slipped inside by mistake years ago. But the longer I looked, the colder I felt. The young man in the picture was unmistakably David. His smile hadn't changed, neither had his eyes. He looked about 23, several years younger than when I met him. Standing beside him was a young blonde woman. She wasn't beautiful in the glamorous sense. She looked tired, almost frightened. In her arms, she held a baby wrapped in a pale blanket. David wasn't touching either of them, but he was standing close enough that anyone would assume they belonged together. I turned the photograph over. Only one thing was written. Spring 1976. I did the math automatically. David and I met in late 1979. We married the following summer. That meant this picture had been taken 3 years before we met. 3 years. 3 years I knew almost nothing about. I searched my memory. Had David ever mentioned someone named Margaret? Had he ever talked about a child? Anything, nothing. Our courtship replayed inside my head. First date, first kiss, meeting each other's parents, buying our first house. Every memory suddenly felt fragile, like I was looking through cracked glass. Rachel walked quietly into the dining room. She saw the photograph still in my hands. I've never seen that one. Neither have I. She shrugged. It must not mean anything. I looked at her. How can you say that? It was taken before you met Dad. Exactly. So I don't know who these people are. Rachel crossed her arms. Mom, everyone has a past. This wasn't in a drawer. No, it was hidden inside our wedding album. She didn't answer. Neither did I. For several minutes, we simply stared at the photograph. Then I noticed something else. David's expression. I'd looked at thousands of pictures of my husband over 45 years. Birthday parties, fishing trips, our daughter's graduation, retirement, hospital visits. His smile had always reached his eyes. Not here. Here he looked. Worried. Almost guilty. I'd never seen that look before. I reached for another album. Then another. Then another. I wasn't searching for memories anymore. I was searching for answers. Hours passed. Rachel eventually left the room. She probably thought I was overreacting. Maybe I would have thought the same thing once. But something inside me had already changed. Near sunset, I spread dozens of photographs across the dining room table. Family reunions, camping trips, Christmas mornings. David appeared in hundreds of them. Yet not one included the woman from the mysterious photograph. It was as if she had been erased. Then another memory surfaced, one I'd forgotten for decades. Early in our marriage, I once asked David what life had been like before we met. He smiled. Oh, nothing worth telling. I laughed. There has to be something. He kissed my forehead. My real life started with you. At the time, I thought it was romantic. Now it sounded like an answer carefully designed to avoid another question. I suddenly remembered something else. Whenever old friends talked about high school or college, David always listened. He rarely shared stories of his own. I had assumed he was simply private. Now I wondered, was he hiding something or someone that night I couldn't sleep? The photograph sat on my bedside table. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the young woman holding the baby and David standing beside them. Not smiling, not proud, just carrying something heavy. For the first time since his funeral, I found myself asking a question I never imagined I'd ask. How well did I really know the man I loved? That single photograph had already taken away my certainty. I had a feeling it was only the beginning. I woke up before sunrise. The photograph was still lying on my nightstand. For a few seconds, I forgot everything. Then I saw David's younger face staring back at me beside a woman I had never known, and the weight settled onto my chest all over again. I picked it up carefully. There had to be an explanation. There simply had to be. For 45 years, David had been the most dependable man I knew. He never forgot our anniversary. He never raised his voice at me. He spent every Christmas Eve assembling toys before Rachel woke up. He held my hand through surgeries, job changes, miscarriages, and finally cancer. People like David didn't lead secret lives. At least, that's what I had always believed. By 8 o'clock, Rachel came downstairs. She had stayed the night after our argument. She poured herself coffee without saying a word. Finally, she looked at me. "You didn't sleep. Neither did you." She shrugged. "I kept thinking about you. I kept thinking about him." Silence filled the kitchen. Then she noticed the photograph in front of me. "Mom, what? I think you're letting one picture rewrite 45 years." I folded my hands. "I'm trying to understand it." "Maybe there isn't anything to understand." "Rachel." She sighed loudly. "What if that woman was just a friend? What if the baby belonged to someone else? What if the picture means nothing?" I looked directly at her. "Then why was it hidden inside my wedding album?" She had no answer. Instead, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "I just don't want this to destroy the way you remember Dad." "It already has." The words slipped out before I could stop them. Rachel's eyes filled with tears. "I miss him too." "I know. I don't want you to lose him all over again." Neither did I. But the questions were already inside me. Ignoring them wouldn't make them disappear. After Rachel left for work, I carried every photo album into the living room. I stacked them in order. If the mysterious photograph had been hidden once, maybe there were others. I spent the next 6 hours examining every page. Not quickly, slowly. Every photograph, every handwritten caption, every empty space where a picture might once have been. Around noon, I noticed something strange. There was a gap, not in the dates, in the photographs themselves. Between 1976 and 1979, David barely appeared anywhere. The albums contained pictures from my own family during those years. College graduation, my parents' anniversary, friends. But there was almost nothing from David's life before we met. How had I never noticed that before? Then I remembered something. Our first apartment. We had been unpacking boxes after the wedding. I found a cardboard carton labeled "Old Photos." I smiled and asked if we should organize them. David took the box from my hands almost immediately. "I'll take care of those." I never saw that box again. Back then, I didn't think twice about it. Now that memory felt completely different. I walked into the attic. Dust floated through the sunlight coming from the small window. Dozens of old boxes lined the walls. Christmas decorations, Rachel's school projects, camping gear. I searched every corner. Finally, I found an old cardboard box with faded black marker. "David." My heart started pounding. I carefully opened it. Inside were old tax papers, instruction manuals, fishing magazines. Nothing personal, nothing emotional, nothing that explained the photograph. I searched again. Nothing. Either the photographs had been removed years ago, or someone had already taken them. That thought made me stop. Rachel had packed away the albums. Had she seen this photograph before I did? When she came home that evening, I asked her directly. Rachel. Yes. When you packed the albums? She nodded. Did you look through them? A little. Did you ever see this picture? She looked genuinely confused. No. You never opened the wedding album. I picked it up, put it in the box, and closed it. I watched her face carefully. She wasn't lying. I knew my daughter. When Rachel lied as a child, she blinked too much. Even at 42, she still did. Now she looked completely sincere. That meant someone else had hidden the photograph decades earlier. Only one person could have done that. David. The realization made me feel strangely calm. Until then, I'd hoped the picture had somehow ended up there by accident. Now I knew better. He had hidden it intentionally. But why? That night, I opened the small cedar chest beside my bed. Inside were every letter David had ever written me. Birthday cards, anniversary notes, Valentine's Day messages, dozens of little reminders of our life together. I read them one by one. His handwriting never changed. Neither did the way he signed every note. Forever yours. By midnight, I had read nearly 40 years of memories. Nothing. Not one clue. No unfamiliar names. No hidden apology. No confession. Only love. Real love. Steady love. The kind that doesn't disappear after hard years. That was what made everything so confusing. If David had betrayed me, why spend a lifetime loving me so faithfully? The pieces didn't fit. Around 1 a.m, another memory surfaced. It was so small, I almost ignored it. One Thanksgiving, about 20 years earlier. Our family had gathered at David's older brother Thomas's house. Someone began telling embarrassing childhood stories. Everyone laughed. Then Thomas started mentioning something that happened in 1976. David interrupted him immediately. So who's ready for dessert? The conversation changed instantly. At the time, I assumed he simply didn't like talking about his younger years. Now I wondered if Thomas had almost revealed something. The next morning, I called him. He answered after the third ring. Amanda. His voice sounded warm as always. How are you holding up? I need to ask you something. Of course. It's about David. He grew quiet. I found an old photograph. Still silence. I think I need to show it to you. Another pause. Finally, he answered. When? I can drive over today. All right. His voice had changed. It sounded heavier, almost nervous. Thomas lived about 90 minutes away. As I hung up the phone, I looked again at the photograph. I noticed something I hadn't paid attention to before. David wasn't looking at the camera. Neither was the woman. Both were staring down at the baby. Almost as though the child mattered more than anything else in that moment. I felt chills run across my arms. Who was that baby? Why had David carried this secret for decades? And why did I suddenly have the feeling that Thomas had been waiting for this conversation for a very long time? I slipped the photograph into my purse. Tomorrow, I would finally meet the one person who might know the truth. Whether I was ready for it was another question entirely. The drive to Thomas Perez's house felt much longer than 90 minutes. I had made that trip dozens of times over the years. Birthday parties, Christmas dinners, summer barbecues. Today, every mile felt heavier than the last. The photograph rested inside my purse on the passenger seat. Every stoplight tempted me to take it out again. Instead, I kept both hands on the steering wheel. I didn't want to look at it anymore. I wanted answers. Thomas lived in the same farmhouse where he and David had grown up just outside Newark, Ohio. After retiring from construction, he spent most of his days tending a vegetable garden and fixing old tractors. He had always reminded me of David. Same brown eyes, same quiet personality. The only difference was that Thomas talked even less. When I pulled into the driveway, he was already waiting on the front porch. That surprised me. Normally, Thomas moved slowly because of his bad knees. Today, he seemed anxious, almost as if he had been watching the road. He hugged me tightly. "I'm glad you made it." "So am I." He stepped aside. "Come in." His house smelled like coffee and fresh bread. Nothing had changed in years. The same family photographs still covered the living room walls. David as a teenager, their parents, fishing trips, military portraits of relatives. I found myself studying every picture, looking for the mysterious woman. She wasn't there, Thomas noticed. "You've already started searching." "I don't know what else to do." He nodded without speaking. We sat at the kitchen table. He poured coffee for both of us. Neither of us touched it. Finally, I reached into my purse. "I found this." I slid the photograph across the table. The moment Thomas looked down, the color drained from his face. He didn't ask where I found it. He didn't ask when. He simply stared, for almost a full minute. Then he closed his eyes. "Oh, David." It was barely more than a whisper. "You've seen it before." He nodded slowly. "Yes." My heart started racing. "So you know who they are." Another pause. He rubbed both hands across his face. "I hoped this day would never come." I leaned forward. "Please." "Amanda, I deserve the truth." "I know." "Then tell me." Thomas looked toward the window. For several seconds, he didn't answer. When he finally spoke, every word came slowly. "David asked me never to talk about this. He's gone. I know. He can't be hurt anymore." Thomas shook his head. It wasn't about protecting himself. My stomach tightened. "Then who was he protecting?" He looked directly into my eyes. "You." The answer made no sense. "Me?" "Yes?" I almost laughed. "How could hiding another woman protect me?" Thomas immediately frowned. "No." "What?" "It wasn't like that." "What wasn't?" "He wasn't hiding another family." I stared at him. "Then explain this photograph." "I can't." "Why?" "I promised him." I felt frustration boiling inside me. "You promised a dead man." "I promised my brother." "And what about me?" His eyes filled with sadness. "I've lived with this secret for 45 years. "So have I." "No. I just didn't know it." Silence settled between us. Outside, I could hear birds singing. Inside, neither of us moved. Finally, I stood up. "If you won't tell me—" "Amanda." Then I'll find someone who will." I picked up the photograph. Before I could put it back into my purse, Thomas spoke. "Wait." I froze. He looked exhausted, like a man carrying something far too heavy. "There is one thing I can tell you." I slowly sat back down. "He loved you." "I know he did." "No." Thomas shook his head. "You don't understand. He loved you more than anyone I've ever known." "Then why keep this from me?" His voice became almost emotional. "Because he believed telling you would destroy everything." I couldn't speak. Thomas continued. "I argued with him." "You did." "Many times. I told him the truth always comes out." "What did he say?" "He said some truths only leave pain behind." I felt tears burning my eyes. "What truth?" Again, he fell silent. I slammed my hand gently on the table. "Thomas, I can't." "You can." "I won't." The room became unbearably quiet. Then he reached across the table and touched the photograph. "Do you see David's face?" Yes. What do you notice? I looked again. He looks worried. Thomas nodded. He carried that expression for years. What happened in 1976? He closed his eyes. I can't answer that. I stood again. This time, I really intended to leave. Halfway to the front door, I heard him speak. Amanda. I stopped. Without turning around, I waited. His next sentence changed everything. Your husband spent the rest of his life trying to protect someone. Not himself, someone else. I turned slowly. Who? Thomas looked away. I can't tell you. A woman. Silence. The baby, nothing. I need more than that. He slowly stood, using the edge of the table for support. His voice was almost breaking. If David wanted recognition, he would have told you himself. So he did something good? I didn't say that. But you didn't deny it. Thomas smiled sadly. Life isn't divided into good people and bad people. No. It's divided into people who make impossible choices. Those words stayed with me. Impossible choices. As I walked toward my car, Thomas followed me onto the porch. Amanda? I looked back. I know you're going to keep searching. I have to. I understand. Then help me. He shook his head. I've already helped as much as I can. One name. No. One place. No. Anything. Thomas hesitated. For a moment, I thought he might finally tell me. Instead, he reached into his pocket. He handed me a small brass key. I looked at it. What is this? Your husband rented a safety deposit box years ago? My heart skipped. He gave me this key shortly before he died. Why didn't you give it to me? Because he told me not to. When the time was right. And now? Thomas looked at the photograph still in my hand. I think the time has finally come. I stared at the tiny key. What bank? He slowly shook his head. I don't know. You expect me to believe that I only knew he had the key? You never asked. He said, if you ever came looking. Thomas stopped himself. If I came looking, what? He said you'd know what to do. I almost laughed through my tears. That's impossible. Maybe. I have no idea where to start. Thomas placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. You've already started. I drove home more confused than when I arrived. I had learned almost nothing, and yet everything had changed. Thomas had confirmed 3 things. First, the photograph was real. Second, David had hidden it intentionally. And third, whatever happened in 1976 wasn't an affair Thomas was trying to cover up. It was something else, something my husband had spent the rest of his life trying to protect. As I pulled into my driveway, I looked once more at the brass key resting beside the photograph. 2 mysteries. One hidden picture, one unknown safety deposit box. And somehow, I knew they were connected. I barely slept that night. The brass key sat beside the mysterious photograph on my kitchen table. Every time I walked past them, I felt as though they were watching me. One promised answers. The other demanded them. By sunrise, I had made a decision. If David had rented a safety deposit box, there had to be records somewhere. I started with the obvious places. His desk, his filing cabinet, the old accordion folder where we kept insurance papers. Everything was neatly organized, just as he had always left it. David believed every document should have a place. Taxes, home insurance, retirement accounts, our wills. Everything was labeled, everything except the thing I needed. There was no bank name, no receipt, no key number, nothing. I sat back in my chair. For a man who organized every paper in our house, David had erased every trace of that box. deliberately. That thought bothered me more than I wanted to admit. Then another idea came to me. If he had been paying for a safety deposit box, he had also been paying someone else. Thomas had hinted at it without saying the words. I opened another drawer. Inside was a stack of old checkbook registers. I almost ignored them. Who keeps checkbook registers anymore? Apparently David had. I carried every register to the dining room. There were more than 30. One for nearly every year of our marriage. Most entries were ordinary. Electric bill, mortgage, groceries, church donations, birthday gifts, nothing unusual. Until I reached the register from 1994. One line caught my attention. Cashier's check, no recipient, just an amount, $3,000. I frowned. Why would David buy a cashier's check instead of writing a normal check? I turned the page. The following year, another cashier's check. Same month, different amount. The year after that, another, then another. My pulse quickened. I pulled more registers from the stack. Every single year. Always in April. Always a cashier's check. Never the name of the person receiving it. Who had needed money every spring for more than 30 years, I grabbed my calculator. Adding every payment took almost 20 minutes. When I finished, I stared at the total. Over $200,000. I whispered aloud. David. That wasn't charity. That wasn't a one-time favor. That was a lifelong commitment. Rachel arrived just after lunch. She immediately noticed the registers spread across the dining room table. What happened now? I found something. She sighed. Mom. No. You need to see this. She sat beside me. I showed her every entry, every cashier's check, every April, every year. At first, she looked interested, then confused, finally irritated. So, she folded her arms. People buy cashier's checks. Every year for 30 years? Maybe it was an investment. No. College savings? No. Property taxes? No. Then what? I don't know. Rachel leaned back in her chair. This is exactly what I was afraid of. What do you mean? You're turning ordinary things into mysteries. I felt my patience slipping. This isn't ordinary. You don't know that. I know your father never mentioned giving away hundreds of thousands of dollars. She stared at me. He also never gambled. No. He never drank. No. He never cheated on you. I looked away. You don't know that anymore. The words hurt both of us. Rachel stood immediately. Don't. What? Don't say that. I didn't. You're thinking it. I couldn't answer. Because she was right. The possibility had entered my mind. I hated myself for it. Rachel softened. She sat beside me again. My dad loved you. I know. Then trust that. I'm trying. No. She shook her head. You're trying to prove he lied. I'm trying to learn why. They're different. Are they? She looked at the registers. If he wanted to hide those payments, he did. Then maybe he had a reason. I believe he did. So why assume the worst? I stared at the mysterious photograph. Because nobody will tell me the truth. Rachel reached for my hand. What if the truth hurts more than not knowing? I answered without thinking. I crossed that bridge the moment I saw this picture. She had no reply. After she left, I returned to the registers. There had to be another clue. Then I noticed something small. Every cashier's check had been purchased from the same bank branch. Not our neighborhood bank. A downtown branch we almost never used. Why? The answer came quickly. Safety deposit boxes. Larger branches usually had them. I drove downtown immediately. The building looked exactly as I remembered. Polished marble floors, tall ceilings, friendly tellers. I approached the customer service desk. A young banker smiled politely. "How may I help you?" "My late husband may have had a safety deposit box here." She typed his name. After several moments, she looked up apologetically. "I'm sorry. We're unable to discuss customer information without documentation." I handed her my driver's license. "Our marriage certificate?" "My husband's death certificate." She disappeared into an office. Nearly 15 minutes passed. Finally, an older manager joined me. "I'm very sorry for your loss, Mrs. Perez." "Thank you. I've reviewed the records." My heart started racing. "And your husband did not maintain a safety deposit box at this branch." The hope inside me collapsed. "But," I looked up, "there is something else." He turned his computer screen toward me. "Our records show Mr. Perez regularly purchased cashier's checks here." "I know. They were always payable through another financial institution." "Which one?" "I'm afraid I cannot disclose that without legal authorization." I closed my eyes. So close. "I'm sorry." As I stood to leave, the manager hesitated. "Mrs. Perez?" "Yes." I probably shouldn't say this. My heartbeat quickened again. "But your husband always mailed those cashier's checks himself." "Mailed them?" "Yes. He never asked us to send them." "Did you ever see the address?" He shook his head. "No. But I remember one thing." "What?" "He always bought a large priority envelope." I frowned. "Priority mail." "Yes." He joked with one of our tellers that some promises were worth paying extra postage for. Promises. That word followed me all the way home. Promises. Thomas had kept one. David had lived one. But to whom? That evening, I searched one last place. The garage. David had built dozens of wooden shelves over the years. Old paint cans, gardening tools, fishing equipment. I wasn't expecting anything. Then I found a small plastic organizer filled with receipts. Most were faded beyond recognition. One receipt caught my attention. United States Postal Service. Priority mail. April. Exactly the same date as one of the cashier's checks. The mailing label had been removed, but a faint ink impression remained underneath. I held it toward the light. Only one word could still be read. Indianapolis. I whispered it twice. Indianapolis. It was the first real location I had discovered. Someone in Indianapolis had been receiving David's money every year for decades. The next morning, I knew exactly what I had to do. I was going there. Whether Rachel approved or not. Whether the truth destroyed me or not. Because after everything I had uncovered, turning back was no longer possible. The next morning, I left Columbus before dawn. I didn't tell Rachel until I was already on Interstate 70. She called 10 minutes later. "Mom, where are you?" "Driving." "I figured that much. I'm heading to Indianapolis." There was a long silence. "You actually went?" "I have to." "You don't even know who you're looking for." "I know where the money went. That doesn't mean you'll find answers." "No. But staying home guarantees I won't." Rachel sighed. "I should come with you." "I need to do this myself." "Mom, if I find something, you'll be the first person I call." She wasn't happy. I could hear it in her voice. "Promise?" "I promise." After we hung up, the highway stretched ahead of me like an unanswered question. For 4 hours, my mind replayed every clue. The hidden photograph. Thomas's silence. The yearly cashier's checks. The word Indianapolis. I kept asking myself the same question. If David had been sending money to someone for over 30 years, why stop hiding now? Or had he planned for me to find it all along? Around noon, I reached downtown Indianapolis. It was larger than I remembered. Busy sidewalks, glass office buildings, construction everywhere. I parked near the address listed on one of the old bank records. It wasn't a home. It wasn't even a bank. It was a law office. Green and Associates. I stared at the brass plaque beside the entrance. My heartbeat quickened. A lawyer. Why would David send money through a lawyer? I stepped inside. The waiting room was quiet. Dark wood furniture, bookshelves filled with legal volumes. A receptionist smiled politely. "Good afternoon." "Good afternoon. Do you have an appointment?" "No. I was hoping to speak with Mr. Samuel Green." She glanced at her computer. "May I ask what this concerns?" "It's about my late husband." She smiled sympathetically. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you. My husband was David Perez." The moment I spoke his name, her expression changed. She looked surprised. "One moment, please." She disappeared down a hallway. Less than a minute later, an elderly man stepped into the lobby. He was probably in his late 70s. Tall, gray hair, sharp blue eyes. He looked directly at me. "Mrs. Perez." "Yes, I'm Samuel Green." He extended his hand. "I've been expecting you." Every nerve in my body tightened. "Expecting me?" He nodded. "Please come into my office." His office overlooked the city. He motioned for me to sit. I remained standing. "How do you know my name?" He folded his hands on the desk. "Because David told me you would eventually come." I felt the room spin. "He said that many years ago. You knew my husband for over 3 decades." I sat down slowly. "What exactly did you do for him?" "I'm afraid I can't answer that." Frustration returned instantly. "I've driven 4 hours." "I know. I've spent weeks searching." "I know." "Then please." His voice remained calm. "I am bound by confidentiality." "My husband is dead." "That does not change attorney-client privilege." I closed my eyes. Another dead end. Samuel watched me quietly. After a moment, he spoke again. "There is one thing I can do." I looked up. "If—" He paused carefully. "You are Amanda Perez?" "I am." "And if David has passed away?" "He has." "Then I may release something he left for you." I couldn't breathe. Samuel stood. He walked to a large antique cabinet behind his desk. He unlocked it with a small key. Then another drawer. Then another. Finally, he removed a large cream-colored envelope. Across the front, written in David's unmistakable handwriting, were 6 words. "For Amanda. Only if she comes herself." My eyes filled with tears before I even touched it. Samuel placed the envelope gently on the desk. He instructed me never to mail it. "Never!" "He said if you never came looking—" Samuel stopped. "What?" "Then you never needed to know." I stared at David's handwriting. My fingers trembled. "So he expected this?" Samuel nodded. "He expected you would eventually ask questions." "When did he leave this? 7 years ago." 7 years. That meant David had prepared this long before cancer. Long before he knew he was dying. "He planned everything." "Yes." I swallowed hard. "Does Rachel know?" "No." "Thomas?" "He knew I was holding something." "But not what?" Samuel shook his head. "No." I reached for the envelope, then stopped. "I have one question. I'll answer if I can. Was my husband a good man?" Samuel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he smiled sadly. "Mrs. Perez." "Yes. In 45 years as an attorney, I've represented wealthy people, politicians, business owners, and judges. He leaned forward. I've also represented people who made terrible decisions. And David, he was one of the few clients who spent more time worrying about other people than himself. That wasn't the answer I expected. So the money? I cannot discuss the money. The woman in the photograph, I cannot discuss her. The child, again he shook his head. I cannot. I laughed bitterly. You really can't tell me anything. I can tell you this. His voice became softer. Whatever you are imagining, he paused. It is probably worse than the truth. That sentence caught me completely off guard. Worse? Yes. So I should open this? You should. But not here. I frowned. Why not? Because David specifically instructed me. Samuel smiled gently. He wrote that you should read it somewhere private. I picked up the envelope. It was heavier than I expected. Not just a letter. Several pages, maybe photographs, maybe documents, maybe the explanation that had haunted me for weeks. I thanked Samuel and walked outside. The afternoon air felt strangely cold despite the summer heat. I sat inside my car. The envelope rested in my lap. I could open it. Right now. No one would stop me. Instead, I couldn't. Not yet. I was afraid. Afraid the man I loved would become someone I no longer recognized. Afraid everything Rachel believed about her father would collapse. Afraid the memories that had carried me through grief would disappear forever. My phone rang. Rachel, I answered. Mom? I found someone. You did? A lawyer? What did he say? He gave me something. What? I looked down at the envelope. A letter. From Dad. Yes. Rachel became quiet. Have you read it? No. Why not? I don't know if I'm ready. Her voice softened. Neither am I. We stayed silent together. Then she whispered, Whatever's inside? Yes. Dad loved you. Tears rolled down my face. I know. I think that's the one thing that won't change. After we hung up, I started the engine. Instead of driving home, I found a quiet park overlooking a small lake. No people, no traffic, only birds and the sound of water. I sat on a wooden bench. The envelope rested beside me. I slowly ran my fingers across David's handwriting one last time. Then I broke the seal. Inside was a handwritten letter. At the top of the first page, I read the opening sentence. My dearest Amanda, if you're reading this, it means the secret I carried for most of my life has finally found its way to you. My hands began to shake. I knew that once I turned the page, nothing would ever be the same again. My hands shook so badly that I almost dropped the letter. I had imagined this moment 100 different ways. Maybe David would confess to an affair. Maybe he had another family. Maybe he had done something terrible. Instead, the first line made me cry before I reached the second paragraph. My dearest Amanda, if you're reading this, it means the secret I carried for most of my life has finally found its way to you. Before you read another word, I need you to know one thing. I have loved you every single day since the moment we met. Nothing you are about to learn ever changed that. I closed my eyes. That sounded like David. Even after death, he worried about my heart before defending himself. I took a deep breath and continued. 3 years before I met you, I made a promise I believed would last only a few months. Instead, it lasted the rest of my life. A promise. The same word Samuel Green had used. The same word the banker had remembered. I kept reading. In the spring of 1976, I met a young woman named Margaret Collins. We were never engaged. We never planned a future together. We simply cared about each other for a short time. My stomach tightened. There it was. The woman in the photograph finally had a name. Margaret. David continued. Several months later, Margaret told me she was pregnant. I stopped reading. The lake in front of me blurred through my tears. For the first time since finding the photograph, I felt genuine anger. He had hidden this from me. For 45 years. I almost folded the letter and walked away. Instead, I forced myself to continue. Amanda, I believed the baby was mine. My breathing slowed. Believed, not was. Believed. One word changed everything. I kept reading. When Ethan was born, I accepted responsibility without hesitation. I wanted to do the right thing. Margaret was alone. Her parents refused to speak to her. The baby's biological father had disappeared long before Ethan was born. I stared at those sentences. The baby's biological father. My eyes hurried to the next page. At that time, neither of us questioned whether Ethan was truly mine. We both assumed he was. I whispered aloud. So, you thought he was your son? The wind carried my words across the lake. David's handwriting remained steady. Then I met you. A tear rolled onto the paper. Everything changed. I smiled despite myself. That sounded exactly like the man I married. I wanted to tell you everything before our first date became our second. Then our second became our third. Every week that passed made the truth harder to say. I understood that feeling. Sometimes silence grows heavier every day until speaking feels impossible, he continued. Margaret never asked me to choose between her and you. That surprised me. In fact, she told me I should marry you. I blinked. Why would she do that? The answer came only a few lines later. She knew I loved you. My chest tightened. I suddenly remembered how deeply David loved me from the very beginning. It had always seemed effortless. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe he had paid a price for it. I turned another page. This one contained only a single paragraph. 5 years after Ethan was born, Margaret asked for a DNA test because Ethan had developed a rare medical condition. The results proved something neither of us expected. I stopped breathing. This was it. The truth. Ethan was not my biological son. I read the sentence again, then again. Then once more. Not my biological son. Everything I had believed during the past week collapsed. There had been no secret child, at least not by blood. The tears I had been holding back finally came, not because I was relieved, because I suddenly understood how lonely David's burden must have been. I continued reading. Margaret cried harder than I had ever seen. She apologized over and over. She said I could walk away. I whispered, and you didn't. The answer waited just below. I looked at Ethan sleeping in his crib. For 5 years, I had loved him. A laboratory report could not erase those years. I covered my mouth. David had already become Ethan's father, not by biology, by choice. The letter continued. I told Margaret I wasn't leaving. Another tear landed on the page. The man who created Ethan disappeared. I refused to become the second man who abandoned him. I finally understood Thomas's words. David hadn't been protecting himself. He had been protecting someone else. Ethan. I kept reading. Margaret begged me to tell you after we married. That surprised me. She believed secrets destroy love. I whispered, she was right. David answered from the page. I wanted to tell you every year. The next several pages were almost unbearable. He described dozens of moments. When Rachel was born. When we bought our first house. When I received Teacher of the Year. Every milestone reminded him of the truth he hadn't shared. Each time I prepared to tell you, I imagined the look on your face. I imagined losing you. And I lost my courage. I leaned back against the bench. I wasn't reading a confession from a selfish man. I was reading the words of a frightened one. That didn't excuse the secret, but it made it painfully human. Then I reached another paragraph. Amanda, I never hid Ethan because I loved him more than you. I hid him because I loved you enough to fear losing you. That sentence stayed with me. It hurt. Yet somehow, it also comforted me. The final pages explained the yearly payments. Margaret refused to accept money after the DNA results. I insisted, not because I owed her, because I had made a promise to a little boy who believed I would never leave. The cashier's checks. 32 years. Every April. Everyone had been part of that promise. David continued. As Ethan grew older, he believed I was simply an old family friend. I frowned. That wasn't what I expected. Then came another surprise. Only after he became an adult did Margaret tell him I believed I was his father once. So Ethan knew, at least part of the truth. The final page was much shorter. Amanda, if you have reached this point, you probably have more questions than answers. He was right. There is only one thing I ask. Please don't judge Margaret. She lost more than either of us ever understood. Then, one final request. If you want the complete truth, please find Margaret. Below that, David had written an address. An assisted living facility. Still in Indianapolis. I stared at it. She was alive. At least when David wrote the letter. Maybe she still was. Maybe I could finally hear the story from the only other person who had lived it. At the very bottom of the page, David had written one final sentence. If you can ever forgive me, tell Ethan that I never stopped thinking of him as my son. I folded the letter slowly. For several minutes, I simply sat there. I had expected to feel betrayed. Instead, I felt heartbroken. Not only for myself, for David, for Margaret, for a little boy caught inside an impossible situation. My phone vibrated. Rachel. This time I answered immediately. Mom! I read it. What did it say? I looked toward the address still lying beside David's letter. It wasn't the story I expected. Is Dad? She couldn't finish. I answered softly. No. No, what? He wasn't the man I was afraid he might have been. There was silence. Then Rachel whispered, So, what happens now? I picked up the paper with Margaret's address. Now. I looked at the nursing home's name one more time. I'm going to meet the woman who changed all of our lives. I sat in my car outside the assisted living facility for nearly 20 minutes. The building was quiet. Brick walls, white columns, flower beds carefully maintained by someone who clearly cared. Nothing about it looked mysterious. Yet somewhere inside was Margaret Collins, the woman whose face had haunted me ever since that photograph slipped from my wedding album. I still wasn't sure how I felt. Angry, curious, sympathetic. Probably all three. I finally stepped inside. A receptionist smiled warmly. Can I help you? I'm looking for Margaret Collins. She checked her computer. Are you family? The question caught me off guard. No. She looked uncertain. Friend? I hesitated. I was married to someone who knew her. The receptionist studied my face for a moment. Then she nodded. Mrs. Collins is having a good day. Those words stayed with me. A good day. They sounded fragile. Room 214? I thanked her and walked slowly down the hallway. The smell of fresh coffee mixed with disinfectant. Residents sat quietly near the windows. Some watched television. Some simply stared outside. I wondered how many stories were hidden inside these walls. When I reached room 214, the door was already open. An elderly woman sat beside the window knitting a pale blue blanket. Her silver hair was neatly brushed. She looked much smaller than the young woman in the photograph, but her eyes, they were exactly the same. She looked up. "Hello." Her voice was soft. "I'm Amanda Perez." The knitting needles stopped moving. For several seconds, she simply stared at me. Then she whispered one word. "David." She knew immediately. I nodded. "He passed away 2 years ago." Margaret closed her eyes. A tear slipped down her cheek. "I know." "You knew?" "Ethan found his obituary." She looked toward the window. "I cried for days." I stepped farther into the room. I wasn't sure if I should come. She smiled sadly. "I've been expecting you?" Those words again. Samuel had said them. Now Margaret. "David thought I would come. He hoped you never would." That answer surprised me. "He hoped?" Margaret nodded. "He prayed you'd never need answers." I sat in the chair beside her. For a while, neither of us spoke. Finally, I reached into my purse. I placed the old photograph between us. Margaret looked at it and smiled through her tears. "I haven't seen this in years." "Where was it taken?" "Outside the hospital. The day Ethan came home." She gently touched the edge of the picture. "David insisted someone take it." "Why? He wanted one picture." "Only one?" "Yes. So he'd never forget." My throat tightened. I remembered David's words. A laboratory report could not erase 5 years. I looked at Margaret. "I read his letter." She nodded slowly. "I wondered if he would finally tell you." "He did." "I'm glad." I took a deep breath. "I need to ask you something." "Anything?" "Were you ever in love with David?" Margaret smiled. "Yes." The honesty surprised me. "But not the way people imagine." "What does that mean?" "We were young." She laughed quietly. "Very young. We cared about each other." "But—" She folded the blanket onto her lap. "David loved deeply." "What do you mean?" "He couldn't pretend." "When he met you?" She smiled again. "I knew." "You knew what?" "That he had found the person he would love forever." Her answer caught me completely off guard. "You weren't angry?" "Oh, I was heartbroken." She laughed softly. "But never angry." "You told him to marry me." "I did." "Why?" "Because I loved him enough to want him happy." I felt tears gathering again. The woman I had spent weeks fearing was nothing like the person I imagined. Margaret continued quietly. "The real tragedy wasn't that David left me." "What was it?" "The real tragedy was Ethan." I looked at her. "When the DNA results came..." She stopped to catch her breath. "I wanted David to walk away." "But he didn't." "No." "He refused." "He said Ethan had already learned to call him Daddy." My eyes widened. "Daddy?" She nodded. "For 5 years." I suddenly understood why leaving had never been possible. Margaret looked at the blanket in her lap. "You know what David told me?" I shook my head. "He said..." Her voice cracked. "A blood test changes biology, not love." I covered my mouth. That sounded exactly like David. I told him he deserved a fresh start. What did he say? He answered. She smiled through tears. Helping Ethan isn't standing in the way of my future. It's part of becoming the man Amanda deserves. I couldn't stop crying. For the first time, I wasn't mourning my marriage. I was mourning the burden David had carried alone. Margaret reached over and gently squeezed my hand. I'm sorry. For what? For the secret. I begged him to tell you. He told me that. I even offered to meet you. Before your wedding, I stared at her. He refused. Why? He said. She laughed sadly. Amanda deserves to fall in love with me before she has to forgive me. That sentence broke something inside me. I could almost hear David saying those exact words. I hated him for keeping it from you, Margaret admitted. But I understood why. I looked toward the window. I don't know if I understand. You will. She spoke with quiet certainty. One day. After a few moments, I asked the question that mattered most. What about Ethan? Margaret smiled. He still loves David. Does he know everything? No. What does he know? He knows David believed he was his father. He knows the DNA truth. But, she hesitated, he doesn't know how frightened David was. Frightened? Every year. Of what? Losing you. She reached toward a small wooden drawer beside her bed. She pulled out an old bundle tied with blue ribbon. Letters. There were many times David wanted to confess. She handed them to me. I wouldn't let him mail them. I looked at the stack. Every envelope was addressed to me. None had postage. Why didn't you let him? Because he never finished them. I opened the first envelope. Inside was only one page. Amanda, there is something I should have told you years ago. The letter stopped there. Another. Same beginning, different year. Same unfinished ending. Another. Another. Nearly 20 letters. Everyone abandoned halfway through. I looked back at Margaret. He tried. So many times. She nodded. He always lost his courage. I carefully tied the ribbon back around the letters. Then I asked the question that had remained in my heart since the beginning. Did he ever regret choosing me? Margaret looked almost offended. Never. He regretted lying. But never loving you. Silence settled between us. Finally, Margaret whispered, There's one more thing. What? Ethan still believes David visited because of me. I frowned. That's not true. She smiled gently. No. Then why? Because once I became stable? She looked directly into my eyes. David kept coming only to see Ethan. The room suddenly felt very quiet. David hadn't continued out of guilt. He had continued out of love, not romantic love. A father's love. Margaret leaned back in her chair. I think it's time you met him. I looked at her. Ethan. She nodded. He deserves to know the woman David loved most. I wasn't sure I was ready, but I also knew I couldn't stop now. Not after everything I had learned. Tomorrow, I would meet the little boy from the photograph. Except, he wasn't a little boy anymore. He was a grown man whose life had been forever shaped by the same man who had shaped mine. I barely slept that night. Margaret's words echoed in my mind. David kept coming only to see Ethan. Not out of guilt. Not out of obligation. Out of love. That single truth changed the way I remembered my husband. Yet one question remained. Who was Ethan now? Margaret had offered to arrange a meeting. She made one phone call the next morning. Then she smiled. He's coming after work. My stomach tightened. What does he know about me? She laughed softly. Only that you were the love of David's life. I wasn't sure whether that made things easier or harder. Around 4 o'clock, I heard footsteps in the hallway. A tall man stopped outside the room. He looked to be in his late 40s, broad shoulders, dark hair beginning to turn gray, kind eyes, for one impossible second. I saw David, not because they looked alike, they didn't, but there was something familiar about the way he smiled before speaking. "Hi, Mom." He kissed Margaret gently on the forehead. Then he noticed me. His expression became curious. Margaret smiled. "Ethan." She reached for my hand. "This is Amanda." He looked at me carefully. "The Amanda?" I nodded. "Yes." He extended his hand immediately. "It's nice to finally meet you." Finally, that word caught my attention. "You knew about me?" He laughed quietly. "I've known your name since I was 25. I blinked. "You have... Oh, yes. My mother talked about you often." Margaret smiled. I told him the truth. Ethan pulled another chair closer. "I always wondered if we'd ever meet." I wasn't sure I wanted to. He nodded. "I understand." There wasn't a trace of bitterness in his voice. That surprised me. We sat quietly for a moment. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "You read David's letter?" "Yes." I figured. "He wanted me to find you. He hoped you would." I studied his face. "Can I ask you something?" "Anything?" "When did you learn David wasn't your biological father?" He leaned back. "About 12 years ago." "How?" "My doctor suggested DNA testing. The results didn't match." He smiled faintly. I thought my whole life had fallen apart. "I can imagine. The strange thing is," he looked toward the window, "David already knew. You asked him. I drove to Ohio." "What did he say?" Ethan laughed softly. He looked at me and asked, "Do you still think I'm your dad?" I felt tears gathering. "What did you answer?" I said yes. And then he hugged me. Ethan smiled through watery eyes. That was the end of the conversation. No explanation. He simply said, Ethan's voice became emotional, "Nothing important has changed today." I covered my mouth. That sounded exactly like the man I had married. He never explained why he stayed. I asked once. "What did he tell you?" Ethan looked directly at me. He said, "A father isn't the man whose blood you carry." He smiled. "He's the man who keeps showing up." Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, I whispered, "He really did keep showing up." "Oh, yes." Ethan laughed. "You should have seen him." "What do you mean?" "He never missed anything. My little league games. My high school graduation. My wedding. He even showed up when my daughter was born." I stared at him. "He met your daughter?" "Many times." "Rachel never knew." "No?" "He kept our worlds separate." I looked down. I wish he hadn't. "So do I." That surprised me. I spent years angry with him. "You did?" "Oh, absolutely." "Why?" "Because I thought he was ashamed of me." My heart sank. "Were you?" He shook his head. "No. Never." "So why did you think that he never introduced me to his family?" His voice grew quieter. "I thought I was the secret." Neither of us spoke. Then Margaret quietly interrupted. "You both misunderstood him." We looked at her. "He wasn't hiding Ethan. He was protecting Amanda. I smiled sadly. That's exactly what Thomas said. Ethan frowned. My Uncle Thomas. No, my husband's brother. Oh, Margaret nodded. David believed if Amanda learned the truth. She stopped. She'd think she came second. I closed my eyes. I understood now. He hadn't hidden another woman. He had hidden his fear. Ethan stood. I want to show you something. He reached into a leather messenger bag. He removed a small wooden box. I've kept this for years. Inside were dozens of envelopes, everyone addressed to him, in David's handwriting. I looked up. He wrote to you? Constantly. But he rarely mailed them. I carefully opened one. Dear Ethan, today. Rachel turned 10. You would have loved teaching her to fish. I looked at Ethan. He wrote about Rachel. Almost every letter. I opened another. Dear Ethan, I watched you graduate today. I wish I could tell everyone how proud I am. Another. Dear Ethan, Amanda made peach pie tonight. I almost brought you a slice. Another. Dear Ethan, I hope someday you'll understand why I couldn't give you more. I stopped reading. The letters weren't filled with guilt. They were filled with longing. Longing for a life he believed he could never have. I whispered. He loved both families. Ethan nodded. I know. I wish he hadn't tried so hard to protect everyone. So do I. He smiled sadly. But that's who he was. Margaret suddenly looked tired. The nurse entered quietly. It's almost time for your medication, Margaret smiled. I suppose that's my signal. Before leaving, the nurse looked at Ethan. She had a difficult morning. After the nurse left, Margaret spoke softly. My heart isn't very strong anymore. I immediately looked at her. Are you all right? She smiled. I've had a good life. No. I've had a blessed life. She reached for my hand. Because of David. Then she reached for Ethan's. And because of him. For the first time, I didn't feel like an outsider. I felt like someone who had stumbled into another branch of the same family tree. As Ethan walked me to my car later that evening, he hesitated. Can I ask you something? Of course. Did David ever stop talking about me? I smiled. I didn't know he was talking about you. He laughed. I guess that answers it. No. I stopped walking. He talked about responsibility. He talked about kindness. He talked about never abandoning people. I never understood where those lessons came from. I looked at him. Now I do. Ethan smiled. You know, what? I think he was teaching both of us. I nodded slowly. I think you're right. Before getting into my car, I turned back. Ethan. Yes. Would you ever consider coming to Ohio? He looked surprised. Why, I think Rachel deserves to meet you. His smile disappeared. You think she'd want that? I don't know, but I think it's time she learned who her father really was. Ethan nodded slowly. So do I. Neither of us realized it then, but bringing our two families together would prove even harder than uncovering David's secret. Because Rachel wasn't ready to forgive a man she believed had lied to all of us, and I wasn't sure she would ever accept Ethan. The drive back to Columbus felt different. When I had driven to Indianapolis, I carried suspicion. Now, I carried truth. The truth wasn't simple. It didn't erase David's mistake, but it erased the version of him I had feared. Still, there was one person who hadn't heard any of it. Rachel. She deserved the truth, whether she wanted it or not. I pulled into my driveway just after sunset. Rachel's car was already there. She was sitting on my front porch with her arms folded. The moment she saw me, she stood. I was about to drive to Indianapolis. I'm sorry. You disappeared for 2 days. I know. You stopped answering your phone. I needed time. She looked at my face. You've been crying? Yes. Is it bad? I took a deep breath. It's complicated. She followed me inside without another word. I made coffee, even though neither of us wanted any. Old habits have a strange way of comforting us. We sat at the same dining room table where everything had started. The photograph still lay there. Rachel picked it up. I hate this picture. I used to. What changed? I know the people in it now. Her eyes immediately lifted. You met them? I did. You met her? Yes. Rachel looked shocked. You actually found her? I found both of them. She frowned. Both? The baby. He isn't a baby anymore. Rachel slowly leaned back. Tell me everything. So I did. I started with David's letter. I told her about Margaret, the pregnancy, the DNA test, the promise, the yearly payments, every detail. Rachel listened without interrupting. When I finished, she remained completely still. Finally, she whispered, So Dad lied to us. The sentence hit me harder than I expected. He kept a secret. That's lying. Yes. She stared at the photograph. For 45 years. Yes. She stood abruptly. I can't believe this. Rachel. No. She began pacing. He looked me in the eyes every birthday. Every Christmas. Every Father's Day. And he never said a word. I understood her anger, because I had felt it too. He wasn't ashamed. How do you know? He wrote 20 letters trying to tell me. She laughed bitterly. Trying isn't telling. No, it isn't. She stopped pacing. Did he love us? I answered immediately. With everything he had. Then why risk losing us? He believed telling us would lose us anyway. Rachel shook her head. He made that decision for us. She wasn't wrong. I quietly accepted it. After several minutes, she sat down again. What was she like? Margaret. Rachel nodded. She isn't who I expected. In what way? She never wanted to take your father away. Rachel looked unconvinced. That's what she says. No. That's what David wrote. Silence. Then I added softly. She begged him to tell me. Rachel looked surprised. She did, many times. So why didn't he? He was afraid. Rachel laughed again. My father was never afraid. I smiled sadly. He was. Of cancer. No, of losing us. Those words finally made Rachel quiet. I reached into my purse. I brought something home. What? The bundle of unfinished letters. I untied the blue ribbon. Rachel picked up the first one. She read only a few lines before tears filled her eyes. He couldn't even finish them. No. She opened another. Same beginning, same ending. Nothing finished, nothing mailed. He wrote all these over 20 years. Rachel slowly placed them back on the table. I've never seen Dad fail at anything. I looked at the letters. I think this was the one thing he couldn't overcome. Rachel wiped her eyes. Then she surprised me. What about Ethan? I smiled gently. What about him? What's he like? I had expected anger, not curiosity. Kind. Quiet. He reminds me of your father. She looked away. Does he hate us? No. Why not? Because he never blamed us. Rachel whispered, I don't think I could have done that. I nodded. I know. There was another long silence. Finally, I said, he wants to meet you. Her head snapped toward me. What? When the time is right. Rachel immediately shook her head. No. Rachel, I can't. He isn't asking you to replace anyone. I know. Then why? She struggled for words. Because? She looked at the photograph again. Every time I see him. You see Dad? No. I see proof that Dad didn't trust us. I couldn't argue. Instead, I reached across the table. I felt exactly the same. What changed? I met him. Rachel lowered her eyes. I don't know if I can. You don't have to today. She nodded. That was enough, for now. The next morning, something unexpected happened. Rachel came downstairs carrying one of the old photo albums. She placed it carefully on the table. I unpacked everything. I looked at her. You did. I shouldn't have boxed them up. You thought you were helping. I was wrong. She smiled sadly. I understand now. What? They weren't keeping you trapped. They were keeping Dad alive. I hugged her tightly. For the first time in weeks, it felt like we were grieving together instead of separately. Then Rachel noticed another envelope beside David's unfinished letters. What's this? I smiled. Ethan gave it to me. She opened it carefully. Inside were photographs. David teaching a little boy to ride a bicycle. David sitting in the front row at a graduation. David holding a newborn baby. Rachel stared at them. He really was there. Every milestone. She touched one picture gently. I've never seen Dad smile like this. I looked closer. She was right. It wasn't the smile he wore for cameras. It was quieter, prouder. The smile of someone watching a child succeed. Rachel whispered, I never knew this part of him. Neither did I. She picked up another photograph. Dad with Ethan's little girl. He became a grandfather twice. The realization hit both of us at the same moment. Rachel looked toward me. My children. She stopped. They have another family. I nodded, whether they know it or not. That afternoon, Rachel quietly gathered every photograph from the table. She placed them back into the wedding album, including the hidden picture. I watched her carefully. You aren't hiding it again. She smiled sadly. No, I'm putting it where it belongs. She closed the album. This picture isn't the enemy anymore. What is the silence? For the first time since all of this began, I believed we were finally moving in the right direction. But neither of us knew that another farewell was coming. The phone call arrived the very next morning. Margaret's nurse. Her voice was gentle. Mrs. Perez. Yes. I thought you should know. My heart sank before she finished. Margaret had a difficult night. I closed my eyes. Is she? The nurse answered quietly. I think you should come as soon as you can. Rachel insisted on coming with me. Neither of us spoke much during the drive back to Indianapolis. The highway looked exactly the same as it had a few days earlier, but everything inside me had changed. I wasn't chasing a secret anymore. I was saying goodbye to someone who had carried part of my husband's heart for nearly 50 years. When we arrived at the assisted living facility, the atmosphere felt different. The nurses smiled politely, but their faces carried the quiet sadness I recognized from the hospice unit, where David had spent his final days. One of them met us in the hallway. You must be Amanda. Yes. And Rachel. My daughter nodded. Mrs. Collins has been asking for both of you. I looked at Rachel. She squeezed my hand. Together, we walked toward room 214. The door was half open. Margaret looked smaller than she had only 2 days before. Her breathing was slower. A thin blanket covered her legs. But when she saw us, she smiled. You came. Of course we did, I said softly. Rachel stepped forward. Hello, Margaret. Margaret reached out a trembling hand. You look just like David around the eyes. Rachel's lips trembled. I've heard that before. Margaret laughed quietly. I imagine you have. Rachel pulled a chair close to the bed. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Rachel surprised me. I'm sorry. Margaret frowned gently. For what, dear? For judging you before I ever met you. Margaret slowly shook her head. You don't owe me an apology. I thought you ruined my parents' marriage. And now... Rachel looked down. Now I think life was harder than I imagined. Margaret smiled. That's usually true. I sat beside the window while they talked. It felt strangely peaceful, almost like watching two strangers discover they had been connected all along. After a while, Margaret looked toward me. Amanda. Yes. Did you bring David's letter? I did. She nodded. Read me the last page. I carefully removed the folded letter from my purse. My hands still shook every time I touched it. I found the final page and began reading aloud. Amanda, if you can ever forgive me, tell Ethan that I never stopped thinking of him as my son. I paused. My voice caught. Margaret closed her eyes. He meant every word. I know. He never missed Ethan's birthday. Rachel looked surprised. Even after the DNA test. Margaret smiled, especially after the DNA test. The room grew quiet again. Then Margaret whispered, There's something in my dresser. I stood. Top drawer. Inside was a small photo album. Nothing fancy, just a worn blue cover. I handed it to her. No. She pushed it back toward me. It's yours. I opened the first page. Every photograph inside showed David and Ethan together. Fishing, baseball games, school plays, camping trips. There weren't many, maybe 30 in total. But everyone captured moments I had never known existed. Rachel leaned closer. Dad looked happy. He was. Margaret nodded. He loved watching Ethan grow. I turned another page. Near the end of the album was a picture that made me stop. David stood between Rachel and Ethan. Rachel couldn't have been more than 3 years old. Ethan looked around 10. They were laughing together in a public park. I stared at it in disbelief. They met. Margaret nodded. Only once. When? You don't remember because Rachel was too little. I looked at my daughter. She shook her head. I don't remember. Margaret smiled. David introduced Ethan as the son of an old friend. He bought both children ice cream. Rachel gently touched the photograph. So we were standing beside each other? Without knowing. Margaret nodded. Sometimes life is strange. I couldn't stop looking at the picture. For years, I believed our two families had never crossed paths. Now I realized they had, only once. But once was enough to make me wonder how many invisible threads had connected us all those years. A knock interrupted our thoughts. Ethan walked into the room carrying fresh flowers. He smiled when he saw us. I'm glad you came. So are we, I answered. He kissed his mother's forehead. How are you feeling? I've had better mornings. She smiled anyway. Ethan looked around the room. I think everyone should hear something. He reached into his jacket pocket and unfolded a piece of paper. I found this after David died. He looked at me. I've never read it aloud. He began. If anything ever happens to me before Margaret, tell her she gave me the chance to become a better man. Ethan stopped for a moment, then continued. Tell Amanda that loving one person never prevented me from loving another in a different way. Rachel quietly wiped away tears. Ethan's voice grew softer. And if Amanda and Ethan ever meet, he looked directly at me. Please remind them that neither of them was ever the mistake. No one spoke. Margaret quietly cried. Rachel reached for my hand. I realized I had spent weeks asking the wrong question. The question had never been whether David loved us. The real question was how one man had managed to carry so much love without breaking apart. Margaret finally broke the silence. I think, she smiled weakly, it's time both of you stopped carrying his guilt. Rachel frowned. What do you mean? Margaret looked at both of us. David carried enough guilt for everyone. You don't have to continue. Her words settled deeply inside me. For the first time, I realized I had been mourning not only my husband, but also his regrets. Late that afternoon, the nurse entered quietly. She checked Margaret's pulse, adjusted her blanket, then looked toward Ethan. I think your mother would like some rest. We all understood. One by one, we hugged her. When it was my turn, Margaret whispered into my ear. Forgive him. I closed my eyes. I already have. She smiled. I knew you would. Rachel hugged her next. Thank you. Margaret gently touched her cheek. Take care of your mother. I will. Finally, Ethan kissed her forehead again. I love you. I know. As we stepped into the hallway, none of us wanted to leave. Something told me this would be the last time I ever saw her. Outside, Ethan stood beside me. I've been thinking. About what? My daughter. What about her? I'd like her to meet you someday. I smiled. I'd like that too. Rachel looked at him. Then after a long pause, she said something I never expected to hear. If you're willing, Ethan looked at her. I'd like to read the rest of Dad's letters with you. He smiled through tears. I'd like that. For the first time since this journey began, it felt as though David's secret was no longer dividing us. It was slowly bringing us together. None of us knew that only hours later, Margaret would quietly slip away in her sleep. And at her memorial service, we would learn that David's kindness had reached far beyond one woman and one child. The phone rang just after sunrise. I knew before I answered. Some calls carry their own silence. Ethan. It's me. His voice was calm, too calm. I'm sorry. I closed my eyes. She passed. About an hour ago. I leaned against the kitchen counter. Rachel looked at my face from across the room. She already knew. Ethan. She wasn't alone. That's good. The nurse said she was smiling. I couldn't stop the tears. I think she was finally at peace. So do I. We stayed on the phone for another minute. Neither of us knew what else to say. Grief doesn't always need words. Sometimes it only needs another person willing to remain on the line. 3 days later, Rachel and I returned to Indianapolis once again. This time, we weren't searching for answers. We were attending Margaret's memorial service. It wasn't held in a church. Margaret had requested something simpler. A small community garden behind the assisted living center. There were folding chairs beneath large maple trees. Fresh flowers lined the walkway. Birds sang overhead. It felt peaceful. Exactly the kind of place Margaret would have chosen. Only about 30 people attended. Neighbors, nurses, a few old friends. Ethan stood near the front greeting everyone personally. When he saw Rachel and me, he walked over immediately. I'm glad you came. We wouldn't have missed it. He hugged me. Then after a brief hesitation, he hugged Rachel too. She returned it. It was awkward, but genuine. Before the service began, a nurse approached us. Mrs. Perez. Yes. Margaret left something for you? She handed me a small envelope. Across the front in shaky handwriting were 3 words. For Amanda. I slipped it into my purse. I couldn't read it yet. The service was simple. People shared memories. One nurse described how Margaret always remembered every employee's birthday. A neighbor recalled how she knitted blankets for newborn babies at the local hospital. An elderly friend laughed about Margaret cheating at card games. Everyone smiled. Then Ethan stood. The garden became completely quiet. My mother spent many years believing her biggest mistake defined her life. He looked toward the audience. It didn't. It was her kindness. It was her courage. It was her ability to forgive herself. His voice became softer, and someone helped her learn that. He paused. David Perez. Every head turned toward Rachel and me. I felt my heart race. Ethan continued. When my mother believed she deserved to be abandoned, David stayed. When she believed she had ruined another person's future, David reminded her that compassion never ruins anything. He smiled through tears. I spent years believing he saved only me. I know now he saved all of us. Rachel quietly reached for my hand. Then Ethan did something unexpected. He looked directly at me. I'd like Amanda to come forward. I froze. What? He smiled gently. Please. I slowly walked beside him. I didn't prepare anything. You don't need to. He turned toward the guests. This is Amanda. The woman my mother respected more than anyone. I looked at Ethan in surprise. He nodded. My mother said something before she died. He swallowed hard. She said, Tell Amanda I borrowed part of her husband's heart for many years. I felt tears immediately. Now give it back. I covered my mouth. The entire garden was silent. I somehow found my voice. I spent weeks believing Margaret had taken something from me. I looked around at the people listening. I was wrong. She protected something precious. The part of David that refused to abandon people. I smiled through tears. I don't think any of us truly owned that part of him. It belonged to everyone who needed him. When I finished, several people quietly wiped their eyes. I returned to my seat beside Rachel. She squeezed my hand. Dad would have liked that. I hope so. After the service, people slowly began leaving. Rachel wandered toward the flower garden. I finally opened Margaret's envelope. Inside was only one handwritten page. Amanda, if you are reading this, I am finally with the people I missed. Please stop carrying anger for me. I stopped carrying guilt years ago. David finally convinced me that forgiveness isn't forgetting. It's choosing peace instead of punishment. I kept reading. You once believed I stole something from you. The truth is, you gave me hope without ever knowing. I frowned. What did she mean? The answer came in the next paragraph. Every time David described you, he became the happiest version of himself. Watching him love you taught me that good people still existed. Another tear landed on the page. The final lines were short. Please love Ethan the way David would have. Family sometimes begins with blood. Sometimes it begins with a promise. Margaret. I folded the letter carefully. Rachel returned just then. You've been crying again. I have. Another letter? I nodded. What did she say? I handed it to her. She read it quietly. When she finished, she whispered, I think I'm beginning to understand. Understand what? Dad. Before I could answer, Ethan walked toward us carrying another box. This belonged to my mother. He opened it, Inside were dozens of photographs. Some I had seen, many I hadn't. But one photograph immediately caught my attention. David stood beside Margaret, beside Ethan, beside me, beside little Rachel. It had been taken at that same park where our children unknowingly met. I stared at it. This is the only picture with all of us together. Ethan smiled. I thought you'd want it. I carefully held the photograph. 2 families, 1 man standing between them, not divided, connected. Rachel looked at the picture for a long time. Then she quietly asked, "Can I keep a copy?" Ethan smiled. I was hoping you'd ask. Later that afternoon, before driving home, Rachel surprised me again. She looked at Ethan. I've been thinking. He waited. My kids have never met their grandfather. He looked confused. They were born after Dad died. She smiled gently. But maybe... She hesitated. They should know the people who knew him best. Ethan's eyes filled with tears. I'd like that. So would I. As we drove back toward Ohio, the photograph rested safely in my lap. For weeks it had represented betrayal. Now, it represented something completely different. Proof that love can exist in complicated places. Proof that one man's quiet kindness had created a family he never imagined. And proof that healing rarely arrives all at once. It comes one conversation, one memory, and one act of forgiveness at a time. Life did not suddenly become simple after Margaret's memorial. Healing never works that way. It arrives quietly, one ordinary day at a time. The first week after we returned to Ohio, Rachel called me every evening. Sometimes we talked for an hour, sometimes only 10 minutes. We rarely discussed David's secret anymore. Instead, we talked about David himself, the man we both remembered. One night, she laughed. "Do you remember Dad trying to fix the dishwasher?" I smiled immediately. He flooded the kitchen. He blamed the instruction manual. He blamed the manufacturer. He blamed gravity. Rachel laughed so hard she had to stop talking. For the first time in weeks, neither of us cried. We simply remembered. That felt like progress. A few days later, Ethan called. "I have a question. I'm listening." "My daughter wants to meet you." I smiled. "I'd like that." "And..." He hesitated. "Would Rachel come too?" I wasn't sure. "I'll ask." When I called Rachel that evening, she was quiet for a long moment. "I'm nervous." "So am I." "What if it's awkward?" "It probably will be." She laughed. "You're honest." "I've learned honesty saves time." She sighed. "Okay, I'll come." The following Saturday, Ethan drove to Columbus. He didn't come alone. His wife Laura came with him. So did their daughter Sophie. She was 22, bright smile, curly brown hair. The moment she stepped into my living room, she looked around with wide eyes. "So this is Grandpa David's house." The words caught me completely off guard. Grandpa David. I had never heard anyone call him that. Rachel noticed my expression. She gently squeezed my arm. "It's all right." I nodded. "It is." Sophie immediately walked toward the bookshelf. "There he is." She pointed at a framed photograph of David holding little Rachel at the zoo. "He looked younger than I imagined." Rachel smiled. "He probably was." Sophie laughed. "My dad has dozens of stories." "But very few pictures." Rachel looked surprised. Dad hated having his picture taken. So did mine. The room fell silent. Then all 4 of us laughed. Of course. They were talking about the same man. Lunch was simple. Sandwiches, soup, coffee, nothing fancy. No one seemed to mind. Conversation came slowly at first. Then Ethan reached into his bag. I brought something. Another photograph. This one showed David teaching Ethan how to tie a fishing lure. Rachel smiled. I've seen that exact face. What face? The one Dad made when he explained something. She laughed. He always acted like every lesson was the most important lesson in the world. Ethan nodded immediately. He did the same with me. Laura smiled. I've heard that story 100 times. Then I brought out one of our own albums. Rachel pointed to a picture. Dad teaching me to ride a bicycle. Sophie gasped. He taught my father too. Everyone looked at each other. The similarities kept appearing. Different years, different children, the same patient man. Rachel whispered, He really lived 2 lives. I shook my head gently. No, I think he lived one. One. He simply gave pieces of it to different people. No one argued, because it felt true. Later that afternoon, Sophie wandered into the family room. She stopped in front of David's old recliner. Did he always sit here? Every evening, I answered. She smiled. My dad has one exactly like it. Rachel laughed. Dad convinced him to buy it. Ethan looked embarrassed. He said every man needed one comfortable chair. Rachel burst into laughter. He told me every woman needed one comfortable chair. Again, we all laughed together. For years, David had unknowingly built the same traditions in 2 separate families. Not because he was pretending, because he was simply himself. Before leaving, Sophie looked at me. Can I ask something? Of course. Would it be all right if I called you Grandma Amanda? The room became completely quiet. I looked toward Rachel. She smiled, then nodded. I felt tears rising. I would love that. Sophie hugged me tightly. It was such a small moment, yet somehow it healed something I hadn't realized was still broken. After everyone left, Rachel stayed behind. We sat on the back porch, watching the sunset. Finally, she spoke. I owe you an apology. For what? I kept trying to protect Dad. You didn't know the truth. I know. But after the truth, she looked down. I kept trying to protect my anger. I understood exactly what she meant. It's easier to stay angry. Yes. Because forgiveness feels like giving up. I smiled softly. But it isn't. No. It's letting go. She nodded. I think I'm finally ready. For what? To stop asking why Dad kept the secret. What will you ask instead? She looked toward the backyard where David had once taught her to throw a baseball. I want to ask how he managed to love so many people. I smiled. I don't think we'll ever completely understand. No. But maybe we don't have to. That evening, after Rachel went home, I carried every photograph onto the dining room table. Old albums, Margaret's photographs, Ethan's letters, David's unfinished confessions, everything. For hours I sorted them into piles, not by family, by time. For the first time, David's entire life unfolded in front of me. No separate stories, no hidden chapters, just one long life. Complicated, beautiful, painful, kind. When I finished, I noticed something surprising. There were no missing years anymore. The gap between 1976 and 1979 had finally been filled. Not with perfect memories, but with truth. The next morning, Rachel stopped by unexpectedly. She looked at the dining table. Wow, I couldn't sleep. She smiled. I can see that. She picked up one photograph after another. Then she asked, What are you making? I looked at the hundreds of pictures spread across the table. A new family album. One album? Yes. She looked surprised. Not separate ones. I shook my head. No more separate stories. Rachel smiled slowly. I think Dad would like that. So do I. Together, we began placing every photograph into chronological order. Wedding pictures, birthday parties, fishing trips, school graduations, the hidden photograph. Margaret, Ethan, Rachel, David. Every chapter, every mistake, every act of love. Nothing hidden, nothing removed. For the first time in nearly 50 years, David's entire story would finally be told. When I retired from teaching, I thought I understood the value of preserving memories. I believed photographs were enough. A smiling face, a birthday cake, a family vacation. Now I knew better. Pictures tell you where people stood. Stories tell you why. The dining room became our workshop. Every Saturday morning, Rachel came over with coffee. Every other Saturday, Ethan drove from Indianapolis carrying another box. Sometimes Laura and Sophie came too. My house slowly filled with voices. The silence that had haunted it after David died began to disappear. The first weekend, we spread everything across the table again. Old albums, loose photographs, letters, postcards, receipts. Even the brass key Thomas had kept for so many years. Rachel picked it up. I can't believe this little key started everything. I smiled. It didn't. What did? One photograph. She laughed. You're right. Ethan carefully placed another stack of pictures beside mine. I found these in my attic. Most showed ordinary moments. David grilling hamburgers, helping Ethan paint a bedroom, watching a soccer game from the sidelines. Nothing dramatic, nothing extraordinary. Yet every photograph revealed another part of the man I thought I already knew. Rachel pointed to one picture. Dad wore that jacket for years. Ethan smiled. He refused to throw it away. He said it was lucky. Rachel laughed. He told me it was comfortable. I smiled. He probably believed both. By lunchtime, we had created a timeline across the entire dining room. David, as a young man, the years before I met him, our wedding, Rachel's childhood, Ethan's milestones, the years after the DNA test, David's retirement, his illness, his final Christmas. For the first time, there were no missing pieces. Rachel stood quietly looking at everything. It's strange. What is? I used to think this secret divided Dad's life. She shook her head. It didn't. It connected everything. I nodded. He never stopped being the same man? That afternoon, Sophie suggested something unexpected. What if every photo had a story beside it? Rachel smiled. I like that. So do I. Instead of simply arranging pictures, we began writing captions. Not dates. Memories. Under the hidden photograph, I wrote, the picture that changed everything and finally told the truth. Under David teaching Ethan to fish, he believed patience was more important than catching anything. Rachel added another beneath a birthday picture. He burned the cake every year, but always volunteered anyway. Ethan laughed. That's true. Laura found another. David holding newborn Rachel. She wrote he cried before anyone else did. I smiled. He absolutely did. Hours passed without anyone noticing. The project slowly transformed. It wasn't becoming a scrapbook. It was becoming a family history. Late that afternoon, Thomas stopped by unexpectedly. Rachel had invited him without telling me. He walked into the dining room and froze. Photographs covered every surface. He immediately spotted the hidden picture. You found them all. We did. He slowly removed his hat. I wish David could see this. So do I. Thomas looked around the room. Then something caught his attention. You included everything. Yes. Even the painful parts. Especially those. He smiled proudly. Your husband would have been terrified. Everyone laughed. Probably. Thomas became quiet. You know. He looked at Ethan. David almost told everyone one Christmas. Ethan looked surprised. He did. Thomas nodded. He stood in the kitchen for nearly an hour. He kept rehearsing. What happened? He walked into the living room. Thomas smiled sadly. Rachel ran over and hugged him. She handed him a homemade ornament. And he lost his nerve. Rachel lowered her head. I don't remember. You were 7. Thomas gently placed a hand on her shoulder. It wasn't your fault. I know. He simply couldn't imagine hurting you. The room fell silent again. Then Thomas reached into his coat pocket. I almost forgot. He handed me a folded piece of paper. What is it? I found it inside one of David's old books. It was a handwritten list. Not a letter, just a list. At the top, David had written, things I never want my children to forget. Children. Plural. I swallowed hard. There were only 5 lines. Be kind before being right. Keep your promises. Call your mother. Forgive faster than you think you should. Love people while they're still here. Rachel quietly wiped away tears. He wrote this? Thomas nodded. He carried it in his wallet for years. I carefully placed it inside the new album. It belonged there. By evening, only one empty page remained. Rachel noticed. We're missing something. What? The ending. She was right. Every album needs a final page. We all looked at each other. Finally, Sophie smiled. I know. She disappeared into the backyard carrying her phone. A few minutes later, she returned. Everyone outside. We gathered beneath the old oak tree behind my house, the same tree where David had built Rachel a tire swing decades earlier. Sophie positioned her camera. Ready? Rachel stood beside me. Ethan stood beside Rachel. Laura stood beside Ethan. Thomas stood behind us. Even my grandchildren joined in. At the last second, Rachel reached for Ethan's hand. He looked surprised. She smiled. Family picture. He smiled back. The camera clicked. Only once. No one asked for another, because everyone knew the first one was perfect. That evening, we printed the photograph. I placed it on the final page of the album. Below it, I wrote one sentence. The family David hoped would someday know each other. I closed the album carefully. For a long moment, no one spoke. Finally, Rachel looked at me. Mom. Yes. What are you going to do now? I looked around the quiet dining room. The investigation was over. The secrets were gone. The albums were finally complete. Only one thing remained. I'm going to visit your father. Rachel smiled gently. I think he'd like that. So do I. The next morning, I carried the finished album to the cemetery. For the first time since his funeral, I wasn't bringing questions. I was bringing him home. I carried the finished family album with both hands. It felt heavier than any photo album should. Not because of the paper, because of everything it contained. Secrets, promises, forgiveness, love. The cemetery was quiet that morning. A cool breeze moved through the rows of headstones. I had walked this path many times since David died. At first I came because I couldn't imagine life without him. Later, I came because I had too many questions. This time, I came because I finally had answers. I stopped in front of his grave. His name, his dates, the simple words beneath them. Beloved husband, devoted father. I smiled. Those words were still true. More true than I had realized. I brushed a few fallen leaves away from the stone. Then I sat on the small bench nearby. The album rested on my lap. For several minutes, I simply looked at his name. Finally, I laughed softly. You certainly knew how to keep a secret. The breeze answered. Or maybe that was only my imagination? I opened the album. The first page held our wedding photograph. I traced David's smiling face with my fingertips. I was angry. I hope you know that. I was hurt. I thought I didn't know the man I married. I turned another page, then another. There was the hidden photograph. No longer hidden. It now sat exactly where it belonged, surrounded by the story that explained it. No longer frightening, simply honest. I understand now. The words came easier than I expected. I don't agree with what you did, but I understand why you did it. I remembered something Margaret had written. Forgiveness isn't forgetting. She had been right. I would never forget. I didn't want to. The next pages held photographs of Rachel, school plays, graduation, her wedding, then Ethan, fishing trips, Little League, his daughter. I smiled. You loved them both. I finally see it. A voice behind me interrupted my thoughts. Mind if I join you? I turned. Rachel. She carried a small bouquet of white daisies. Dad always liked these. I remember. She placed them beside the headstone. Then she sat next to me. For a while we looked through the album together. Neither of us hurried. Each page deserved its own moment. Rachel stopped at the final photograph, the one Sophie had taken, all of us together beneath the old oak tree. She smiled. I still can't believe this happened. I know. It feels impossible. It almost didn't. She laughed quietly. Can you imagine what Dad would say? I smiled immediately. He'd probably complain about having his picture taken. Rachel laughed. Definitely. We closed the album together. Then she looked at the headstone. I've been thinking. About what? For weeks? She hesitated. I kept saying Dad lied. You did. I still believe he did. I nodded. But, she took a deep breath. That's not the sentence I want to remember. What sentence do you want? She looked at David's name. I want to remember that he stayed. The simplicity of those words struck me. He stayed. For me, for Rachel, for Ethan, for Margaret, for every promise he made, even when keeping those promises cost him peace. Rachel continued. I spent so much time asking whether Dad deserved forgiveness. She smiled sadly. I forgot to ask whether he deserved gratitude. I squeezed her hand. He deserved both. I think so too. Just then, another car pulled into the cemetery. Ethan, Laura, Sophie, even Thomas. No one had planned it. No one had called. Yet somehow we had all arrived at the same place. The same morning. Thomas laughed. Looks like David organized one last family gathering. Everyone smiled. We stood together around the grave. No awkward introductions. No uncertainty. Only family. Thomas looked at the headstone. You stubborn old fool. Rachel laughed. You always called him that. Because he was? Thomas smiled through tears. But he had the biggest heart I've ever known. Ethan stepped closer. I never got to say goodbye. He gently placed one hand on the stone. So, he smiled. Thank you. For every baseball game, every fishing trip, every letter you never mailed, and every promise you kept. Laura quietly wiped her eyes. Sophie slipped her arm around her father. No one spoke for several minutes. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It felt complete. Before leaving, I opened the album one final time. Inside the back cover, there was still a blank space. Not a page, just a small pocket. I reached into my purse. David's list. Things I never want my children to forget. I slid it carefully into that pocket. Now the album was truly finished. Rachel noticed. That's the perfect place. I think so too. As we walked back toward the parking lot, Sophie suddenly asked, Grandma Amanda. Yes? Will you tell this story to my children someday? I smiled. If they want to hear it. I think they will. Rachel looked at me. So will mine. I nodded. Then I'll tell them everything. No secrets. No missing pages. Thomas opened his car door. I think David would finally approve. I laughed. I hope so. Weeks later, the album found a permanent home in my living room. Not hidden in a closet, not packed inside a box. Anyone who visited could open it. Anyone could read the captions. Anyone could see every photograph. The happy ones, the painful ones, all of them. Because families aren't built from perfect stories. They're built from truthful ones. Sometimes I still miss David so much that it hurts. Grief doesn't disappear simply because questions are answered. But now, when I miss him, I don't remember only the man I lost. I remember the man he tried so hard to be. The husband who loved me. The father who raised Rachel. The father who chose Ethan. The friend who kept impossible promises. The frightened man who carried too much alone. And finally, the man I forgave. If you've stayed with me through this journey, thank you. If there's one lesson I hope you carry away, it's this. The people we love are rarely perfect. But perfection was never the goal. Showing up, keeping promises, choosing kindness, those are the things that truly last. Sometimes one forgotten photograph can uncover decades of hidden truth. But sometimes, that same photograph can also remind us that love is far bigger than the secrets it leaves behind. Before you go, I'd love to hear from you. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss more stories like this. Now tell me in the comments, do you think you could forgive someone who kept a secret like David's? Why or why not? And if you're watching from somewhere in the world, let me know where you're watching from. I read as many comments as I can, and I truly enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. Thank you for spending your time with me today. Until next time, take care of the people you love and never wait too long to tell them how much they mean to you.